family and I send love to his family. So that was really sad. Nancy Wilson from Heart, R.I.P. Dear Eddie, you were in a long struggle. I will always cherish our friendship and that twinkle in your childlike eye. R.I.P. Eddie Van Halen. I think those two dated early in the day. Of course. What? Yeah, you didn't know that? Nancy Wilson and Eddie, I think, dated like a million years ago, like back in the 70s.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay.
Look it up. I think so. I think that's true. Alex spoke and said, "Hey, Ed, love you. See you on the other side. Your brother, Al." Man, a few words. We all know that Alex is a sort of a quiet, stoic type, but we all know that nothing was closer to Eddie than Alex in terms of other people. Now, Dweezil Zappa, who absolutely worships Eddie Van Halen, said Edward Van Halen himself was lightning in a bottle, and he could transfer that energy to arenas and stadiums like nobody before or since. Van Halen as a band left audiences feeling like they were floating above the ground for weeks after seeing them perform. The band described it as playing for 10,000 of their closest friends at their apex, and there was nothing that could compete with the almighty Van Halen. He also said that Eddie didn't play the electric guitar like us. The guitar was filtered through him and his deft guidance. He made it look easy. We know it wasn't. For many, he will always be the king. Long live the king. And that came from Dweezil. That was on his website. Now, Mitch Malloy spoke out, Dave, and he gave an interview exclusively to the California Rock News. Now, we all know, as Dave likes to call him, Van Halen's lost boy, right, Dave? I mean, that's what we all know him as.
Well, wasn't that the title of like some?
Yes, that was his title
some
of
video that was done years ago.
Yeah, his YouTube mini documentary about his very brief time in Van Halen. That's right. So Van Halen's lost by Mitch Malloy. Now, just for those of you who are not in the know, shame on you. He was the singer that apparently was hired before Gary Cherone to replace Sammy Hagar, and somehow got lost in the sauce. So he says here that he was surprised but wasn't surprised. I was shocked, but I wasn't shocked when he heard about the news of Eddie's passing. There was a time he was calling me every day, he said, after Gary left the band. He says, this is right after Gary and he parted ways. In fact, it started that day. He was actually crying, and it wasn't the first time he actually cried with me over the phone. He was just super emotional and awesome. Anyway, about a week at least had passed, and he was calling daily. Then one day, he asked me what I thought he should do next. And I said, honestly? And he said, of course, honestly. Then I said, get Dave back. And for the first time, he yelled at me, and I think he felt betrayed by me for suggesting it. So I thought that was an interesting little nugget to come out of an interview. What do you think about that?
Yeah, that I didn't know that those guys were still talking. But, I mean, was Ed really surprised that somebody was going to say that?
I mean, I know. It's kind of like,
and it's not like Mitch's suggestion was out there. Because I'm sure Mitch wasn't the only guy making that suggestion.
No, right. Of course. So now another interview that was done by Rolling Stone, Gary Cherone. We all know as the third lead singer of Van Halen, Dave's favorite lead singer of Van Halen, that he will always hold his time with Eddie close to his heart, and that they hit it off on day one. He said he made me feel comfortable, and he went out of his way to make me feel comfortable. He was just a regular guy, and we ended up being kindred spirits. When he was asked when he was told he was in the band, he said it was the second day he told me I was in the band. And he says for Nuno from his band Extreme and Pat Badger as players, he says Van Halen was the top. He says that with Extreme, Nuno would be the first to say there was no bigger influence. And when he called Nuno, when Eddie passed, the last thing he said was, he was my guy. And I said, I know, Nuno. So he also went on to say that he sang Without You, the first song on Van Halen 3, into an SM57 microphone, and Eddie was smoking in his face when he did it. He said, little did I know that some of those tracks would be on the record. Which goes to show you that, remember we always talk about how Van Halen 3 sort of has almost a demo quality to it a little bit, that a lot of that was kind of recorded on the fly. He says, we just clicked as writers. We were both kind of a socially awkward people. We come from different camps. He had one way of writing with the other guys, whether it was Sammy or Dave, and one of the things that I did with Extreme that he never did with Van Halen is I would have lyrics written and I would hand them to Eddie, and he said it was the first time he ever got to write to the lyrics, because usually Eddie would write the music and then hand it over to the guys to do the lyrics. He says with the other guys, he generally write the music first, then he give them the music to go write the lyrics. Maybe to a fault, he says there was a freedom that we had on Van Halen 3 that maybe made it too eclectic for the Van Halen fans. When he sat down at the piano and played, I would sit there in awe. I encouraged that. I think he enjoyed that freedom. Some people critiqued it as an Eddie Van Halen solo album. I don't think that's fair. I think Eddie found a new freedom in his writing. When they asked him about whether Van Halen 3 was kind of like, how would you explain the eclecticism? He says, there was some rock stuff, but there was some stuff that was maybe a little outside the spectrum of Van Halen. If anything, it was pure. There was no record company pressure. We just wrote. In a way, I was a tool for him and whatever he wanted, which kind of goes to prove that, he kind of liked, I guess, Gary's easy-flowing personality, and he just sort of would do whatever he wanted, right, Dave?
Yeah, I mean, there wasn't nearly as much ego with Gary as there was with Sam or Dave.
Yeah.
And, I mean, Gary, we've gone over this before, but Gary comes from Extreme where Nuno is the band leader.
Right.
So Gary is more of a team player than a team leader.
Right.
Which, honestly, I think Ed was looking for, because he had enough of lead singers who were looking to lead the band, and Ed was at a point where he wanted to lead his own band. So in terms of band dynamics, I think Gary worked out really well. And, the one thing that Gary did provide Ed that Sam did not do consistently were better lyrics.
Right.
I mean, say what you want about Van Halen 3, and I say a lot.
Right.
But lyrically, it's certainly better, more deep, challenging, things like that.
Right.
Gary tends to be good at that, and in that sense, he succeeded.
Right.
But yeah, so interesting insight from Gary.
Yeah.
Who's is always like a deep thinking kind of guy. So I honestly expect no less from him.
Yeah, that's for sure. He also said that he was talking about how Many Say I came about. He said that kind of like Eddie was in bed with Valerie, going to sleep, and then he ran downstairs to start recording the song on piano. And he said he went downstairs and made a really shitty recording of it. And he said, hey, man, I wrote something to How Many Say I, because I guess Gary had given him the lyrics first. And he plays it for him, and he says, that's beautiful, Ed. Your voice reminds me of Roger Waters and Leonard Cohen. He didn't necessarily want to sing it. He just wrote it, and I encouraged him. I said, no, that's beautiful. But he says, maybe we were being too artsy-fartsy, but I thought it was great. And, of course, I got ripped apart by the fans. But I was proud of the fact that it was the only record where Eddie sang on it. And I'm sure people appreciate that now. I'm proud of that. And I've always loved that song.
I think Gary should have sang it.
That's true. Well, okay.
I think if Gary had sang it, it would have. I mean, I don't know if anybody would have liked the album any better, but
yeah, it went down a bizarre road with that. I mean, it was. I mean, I tell you, it's kind of sort of interesting to hear now. Gary's got a point with Ed gone, and to hear his voice.
I see where he's going with that, and I don't disagree, but still, maybe honestly, because I'm not a fan of Leonard Cohen or Roger Waters or any of these guys who, even like Dave, you and I are big Keith Richards fans, but I'll be the first to admit that vocally, Keith, Keith's tolerance is really not that high on his solo albums,
Right.
I'm not a fan of that style of singing and that style of music. Right. So that's why, How Many Say I vocally never really appealed to me.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, you see where Gary's going, but in retrospect, I think he's right. I think they had a little too much freedom. There was a little too much eclecticism. I think we've said this before. There was nobody really reining them in on Van Halen 3 to say this is a good idea. This is not such a good idea.
He also said that on Van Halen 3, I thought Eddie was playing with a lot of passion and he was dangerous. There was always one wheel off the track. Year to the Day solo was just beautiful. I think it is one of the best things he ever did. So that's sort of interesting. And he said that throughout the process Eddie was happy. He and Alex had a dressing room, and that him and Michael had another one. And the shows that they played were great. And that when they went to choosing the set list, Alex told Gary, pick whatever you want. I'll do anything. And Gary went and picked things like Romeo Delight and I'm the One and Mean Street and Unchained. And he says that when they parted, they left as friends and they kept in touch for a couple of years. And then they sort of drifted apart. He said, not anything intentional. And then he said, about 5 years ago, I reached out and he immediately responded. We reconnected and kept in touch ever since. And he said they kind of picked up from where they left off as being friends. And the last time we were in contact was a couple of months ago before he passed. He says everyone knew something was going on, but it was a tight camp, small circle, and everybody knew and respected that whole thing with Ed because he wanted to. He says he was a tough man. He was always upbeat, but he never let him get him down. So that was kind of an interesting perspective from Gary, who obviously had kept in touch with Ed. Any thoughts on that, Dave? Any more thoughts?
No, that's cool. Well, that's cool they reconnected. It's nice that Ed did reconnect with people. He kind of had a reputation as a guy who held a grudge for a long time and couldn't let go of things. But with Gary and with Sam, that obviously wasn't the case.
Right, obviously. Now, interesting enough is Ted Templeman came out and did an interview with Rolling Stone. And Rolling Stone, who only put one album on the top 500 list of greatest albums of all time, and Van Halen at number 292, you know, they did a lot of reporting on Eddie Van Halen's death, that's for sure. So apparently, Ted, when he first met Ed, he says they had nothing. In fact, when he showed up for the first sessions, his car door was wired shut with a guitar wire, if you can believe that. He said that he was in touch right up until the guitarist's death, and that they were friends. He says he told me that day that he had just had his first steroid shot. He talked about his cancer diagnosis, and he was okay. And within 2 weeks, he was in the hospital. And from then on, we would talk, but then pretty soon he couldn't talk. And he sent me texts every day like, oh my God, the chemo's terrible. And then it got to the point where he would just send little hearts at the bottom of a text, says, I love you, Ted, and that kind of stuff. He says one time he texted, Ted, you were the first one who ever believed in me. So that was really sweet. He says that Ed was really, really shy, and that once he got his own studio going, he got really creative, and it was great to see all that happen, he said. And he said that really recording Ed was sticking a mic in front of his amp because he already had a great sound. He goes, you didn't have to do anything to it. He says they would lay down 30 songs in one day when they first got together to see everything that they had when he first got together with Van Halen. And he goes, he would never make a mistake. He always played perfectly. And he did admit that Ed was a huge fan of the Dave Clark 5. He always noted that as his inspiration to getting into music. He said he was a very self-conscious guy because when he was in school, he only had spoke Dutch and he was having trouble with English, so people kind of gave him a rough time in school, so he was a little insecure. And when he talked about Eruption, he says that I walked out to use the restroom or get a coffee outside of Sunset Sound, and I heard him playing. It sounded something like you could only play on an organ, like a Bach fugue, or I couldn't even believe it was coming from a guitar. I was like, what the hell is that? And he says, oh, it's nothing, just something I warm up with before the show. I yelled at Don, roll tape, and he says, I'm already rolling. He said that Dave was super innovative, and the lyrics that he came up with at the beginning were like nothing that was out there, and Ed would pick up on a lyric and go somewhere with it. He said it was a true songwriting team, and he says that, you know, they did have a bit of a problem with the relationship. Started really a kind of a crack in their relationship, believe it or not, was the dancing in the street situation, because Ted had made Ed add his own composition to the Dancing in the Street cover. Ed had this riff. Ted suggested, why don't we make it into Dancing in the Street? And I thought it would be wild and kind of do this Motown thing, and then it would be sort of like Summertime type of single, and that caused the real problem. He says Ed didn't want me to do that, and it was our only choice, and we had to get the record out, and that caused a riff, which was difficult. And then he said, I was just listening to outtakes of recordings where they're laughing on one take of Happy Trails, and Ed's going, Ted, please don't